Close your eyes for a moment and picture this: a world where towering stone castles rise from misty valleys, where armored knights pledge loyalty to kings, and vast empires stretch across continents, built not by chance, but through moments so pivotal they echo through the centuries. This isn't just a scene from a storybook. It's the real, pulse-pounding drama of medieval history, where every decision, every battle, and every alliance could make or break an empire. Today, we're stepping into that world, tracing the 30 most defining moments that shaped the rise of medieval empires, moments that didn't just change maps, they changed the course of humanity itself. Think about the last time you stood in awe of something ancient: a crumbling castle wall, a weathered manuscript, or even the echoes of a long-forgotten battle cry. What you're feeling is the weight of history, the invisible threads connecting us to the ambitions and struggles of those who came before. From Charlemagne's coronation as Emperor of the Romans to the dramatic fall of Constantinople, these aren't just dates in a textbook. They're turning points where visionaries gambled everything, where cultures collided and fused, and where the foundations of our modern world were laid stone by stone. So why does this matter to you? Because these empires weren't built on luck, they were built on choices. The kind of choices that teach us about power, resilience, and the incredible human capacity to adapt and conquer. By the time we reach the end of this journey, you'll see medieval history not as a collection of dusty artifacts, but as a living, breathing saga of ambition, betrayal, and triumph. This is the story of how empires rose from the chaos of the Middle Ages and how their legacies still shape our lives today. Ready to uncover the secrets behind the world's most formidable medieval empires. Let's begin. On that frosty Christmas morning in the year 800, inside the Grand Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, history held its breath. As Charlemagne knelt in prayer, Pope Leo Roman III placed a golden crown upon his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans, a title dormant for over 3 centuries in the West. But this wasn't just a coronation, it was a seismic shift, stitching together the fractured pieces of Europe under a single vision. Charlemagne, the towering Frankish king, had spent decades forging his realm through conquest and diplomacy, yet this moment transformed him from a warrior into something far more enduring, a symbol of unity. Think about the sheer audacity of what unfolded. Rome's imperial legacy, once extinguished by barbarian invasions, was now reborn through a Germanic ruler blessed by the Church. It was a masterstroke of political theater, blending the sacred and Chinese letter. The Pope gained a powerful protector, while Charlemagne's rule gained divine legitimacy, a mutual exchange that would define medieval politics for centuries. But Charlemagne didn't just wear the crown, he reshaped it for a new age. His court at Aachen became a beacon of learning, where scholars preserved crumbling Latin manuscripts and standardized handwriting so future generations could read them. Monks copied texts in a new, legible script Carolingian minuscule, an innovation as revolutionary as the printing press would be centuries later. Yet the true genius of Charlemagne's reign lay in how he governed. He divided his vast empire into counties overseen by loyal nobles, creating a web of accountability that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. Missi Dominici, his royal envoys, crisscrossed the realm to ensure justice wasn't just a promise but a practice. And in an era when most rulers could barely sign their names, Charlemagne, though never fully literate himself, championed education, founding schools to train the next generation of clerks and bishops. What makes this coronation one of history's defining moments isn't just the glitter of the crown or the grandeur of the title. It's how Charlemagne's empire became a bridge between the ancient world and the medieval, between chaos and order. When later emperors claimed his legacy, they weren't just invoking a name, they were reaching for a blueprint of how to rule. Without that Christmas day in Rome, Europe might have remained a patchwork of warring tribes. Instead, it took its first steps toward a shared identity, one that would shape kingdoms, crusades, and even the modern map. Autumn winds howled across the plains of central Gaul in the year 732, where two worlds collided in a storm of steel and destiny. The Umayyad Caliphate, having swept across Iberia like a desert gale, now turned its gaze northward, their cavalry's hooves drumming toward the heart of Christian Europe. But standing between them and total domination was a grizzled Frankish commander named Charles Martel, whose makeshift army would become the bulwark that changed history. This wasn't merely a clash of armies, it was a collision of civilizations where the future of an entire continent hung in the balance. What made the Battle of Tours so extraordinary wasn't just the scale, it was the improvisation that won the day. Martel's Franks, mostly foot soldiers, faced the Umayyads' feared Berber cavalry, a force that had toppled kingdoms from Damascus to Gibraltar. But Martel understood terrain like a chess master. He positioned his men on wooded high ground, forcing the Umayyad horsemen to charge uphill into a bristling wall of Frankish axes and spears. When the Muslim cavalry broke against that unyielding infantry line, it marked more than a defeat, it revealed a tactical revolution. Heavy infantry, once considered obsolete against mounted warriors, became the cornerstone of European warfare for centuries. Yet the real stakes were far grander than battlefield tactics. Had Martel's line shattered that day, the Umayyads would have found the gates to Europe wide open. Imagine a world where Arabic, not Latin, became the lingua franca of Paris and Cologne. Where Moorish arches crowned cathedrals and Islamic jurisprudence shaped European legal codes. The Frankish victory didn't just preserve Christianity's foothold west of the Rhine, it ensured Europe's cultural DNA remained distinct from the Islamic world's dazzling intellectual sphere. Martel's triumph rippled far beyond that bloodied field. By proving the Franks could defend Christendom, he laid the foundation for his grandson Charlemagne's empire. The very notion of a united Christian Europe, later embodied by the Holy Roman Empire, traces its roots to this moment, and when historians debate what-if scenarios, few are as staggering as Tours. For in the space of one autumn afternoon, the fate of languages, religions, and borders yet unborn was decided by men who could never imagine the weight of their struggle. That's the power of a defining moment. It doesn't just change the map, it changes what's possible. The Seine River ran red in the year 845 as dragon-prowed longships sliced through the pre-dawn fog, their decks crowded with warriors who would become legend. Paris, jewel of the Frankish realm, awoke to the nightmare every coastal town had feared. The Vikings had come inland, led by the fearsome Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure straddling history and myth. This wasn't just a raid, it was a calculated strike at the heart of an empire. The Franks had weathered battles before, but nothing like this. These weren't ordinary marauders, they were master navigators who'd crossed oceans, tacticians who exploited rivers like highways, and psychologists who wielded terror as deftly as their axes. What made this siege so chilling wasn't just the violence, it was the Vikings' ruthless efficiency. They bypassed coastal defenses by sailing up the Seine, turning France's own waterways against it. When Paris's defenders retreated to the Isle de la Cité, the city's fortified island core, Ragnar's men simply scaled the walls or burned what they couldn't breach. King Charles the Bald, Charlemagne's grandson, faced an impossible choice: fight and risk total destruction, or pay the price of survival. The 7,000 pounds of silver he handed over wasn't just a ransom, it was a beacon to every Viking crew from Norway to Denmark, proof that Europe's wealthiest kingdoms could be bled dry. But the real shockwaves from Paris reached far beyond that silver hoard. The siege exposed a fatal flaw in the Frankish Empire. Centralized power crumbled when distant kings couldn't protect local communities. Farmers and merchants, abandoned by their monarch, turned to regional lords who could build castles and raise militias. Thus began feudalism's rise, a patchwork of local strongholds that would define medieval Europe for centuries. Walls grew thicker, knights became essential, and the very idea of safety shifted from empires to armored men on horseback. Yet to dismiss the Vikings as mere destroyers misses their astonishing legacy. Those same longships that carried raiders to Paris also opened trade routes stretching from Baghdad's bustling markets to Iceland's frozen shores. They founded Dublin, shaped Russian identity as the Ruse, and even reached North America centuries before Columbus. Their siege of Paris wasn't just an ending. It was a catalyst forcing Europe to adapt in ways that would birth new political systems, military technologies, and even cultural exchanges. The Vikings didn't just take silver, they left an indelible mark on how empires defended, governed, and ultimately redefined themselves against the unexpected. The air inside Constantinople's Hagia Sophia hung thick with incense and tension on that fateful day in 1054, as a papal legate marched down the nave and slapped a parchment onto the altar, an act that would crack the foundation of Christendom itself. The Great Schism didn't erupt overnight. It was the culmination of centuries of simmering disputes over everything from the nature of the Holy Spirit to whether priests should wear beards. But when Pope Leo IX and Patriarch Michael I excommunicated each other, the rupture became permanent, splitting Christianity into two rival branches: Roman Catholic in the West and Eastern Orthodox in the East. This wasn't just a theological divorce, it was a geopolitical earthquake that redrawn the spiritual map of the medieval world. Consider the staggering implications of this divide. For centuries, the Church had been the glue holding Europe's fractured kingdoms together, a shared spiritual language that transcended borders. Now that unity shattered like stained glass. The Byzantine Empire, already straining under Seljuk Turk invasions, found itself isolated from Western allies who no longer saw Constantinople as a spiritual sibling. Meanwhile, Rome's popes gained unchecked authority over Western Europe, paving the way for papal supremacy and later the Crusades. Imagine the ripple effects when Norman adventurers conquered Orthodox Sicily, or when Crusaders sacked Constantinople itself in 1204. These weren't just military campaigns, they were collisions of worlds that no longer recognized each other's sacred truths. Yet the schism's deepest wounds weren't on battlefields but in hearts and minds. Ordinary believers who once shared communion now viewed each other with suspicion. The Eastern Orthodox retained their ancient Greek traditions, their icons glowing with gold in candlelit sanctuaries, while the Latin West embraced scholastic theology and the soaring Gothic cathedrals that pierced the heavens. Two versions of Christianity, both claiming to be the true faith, now competed for souls and sovereignties. And when the Ottomans finally breached Constantinople's walls in 1453, the Byzantines' desperate pleas for Western aid went unanswered, a stark reminder of how ideological divides can outweigh even existential threats. What makes the Great Schism one of history's defining moments isn't just the division itself, but how it taught empires a brutal lesson. Faith could be both a unifying force and a weapon of fragmentation. For the next 1,000 years, this rift would shape alliances, inspire wars, and even influence modern geopolitics, proof that when spiritual bonds break, the fractures can outlast dynasties, empires, and entire eras. The echoes of that parchment slapping onto the altar still resonate today, a testament to how ideas once split can alter the course of civilizations. Dawn broke over Senlac Hill on October 14, 1066, revealing an army of Norman knights tightening their helmet straps beneath a banner blessed by the Pope himself. William, Duke of Normandy, wasn't just fighting for a crown, he was about to rewrite England's destiny with a single, brutal day's work. The clash that followed at Hastings wasn't merely a battle, it was a cultural earthquake whose aftershocks would reshape everything from English kitchens to courtrooms. When King Harold fell with an arrow through his eye, it marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule and the birth of a hybrid civilization where Viking resilience met French sophistication. What made the Norman conquest so revolutionary wasn't just the change of leadership, it was the systematic dismantling and rebuilding of England's institutions. William didn't just claim the throne, he redistributed nearly all the land to his Norman barons, uprooting the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy overnight. Castles mushroomed across the countryside, not just as military strongholds but as symbols of a new feudal order where loyalty flowed upward to the crown. These stone fortresses, like the Tower of London's stark white tower, weren't just buildings, they were psychological weapons, reminding rebellious locals that Norman rule was here to stay. Language itself became a battleground. In courtrooms and markets, Old English collided with Norman French, creating linguistic layers that still define modern English. While peasants raised sheep and cows in the fields, their Norman overlords dined on mutton and beef at table, a culinary class divide fossilized in vocabulary. Even today, English legal terms like jewry, trespass, and property carry the imprint of Norman bureaucrats who overhauled the justice system. The Domesday Book, that astonishing survey of every pigpen and ploughland in England, wasn't just administrative genius, it was a declaration that no detail, no matter how small, would escape the conqueror's grasp. Yet the most enduring legacy of 1066 was how it yanked England into Europe's orbit. Suddenly, this island kingdom was entangled in French politics, its kings spending more time defending Normandy than governing England. The rivalry that flowered here would bloom into the 100 Years' War, shape the Renaissance balance of power, and even influence the colonization of North America. When modern Britons debate their ties to Europe, they're unknowingly echoing debates sparked by a Norman duke's ambition 9 centuries ago. That's the paradox of Hastings, a battle fought with swords and arrows that still whispers in parliamentary debates and dictionary entries, proving that when cultures collide, the victors don't just claim land, they reshape time itself. Snow crunched under bare feet in the bitter January of 1077 as Emperor Henry IV, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, stood shivering outside Canossa Castle's iron gates. For 3 days and nights, the most powerful man in Europe wore a penitent sackcloth, begging Pope Gregory VII for forgiveness. This wasn't just personal humiliation, it was the climax of the Investiture Controversy, a decades-long battle over who truly held God's authority on earth, kings who crowned bishops or popes who claimed to anoint kings. At first glance, the dispute seemed bureaucratic, whether monarchs or clergy should appoint bishops and abbots. But peel back the layers and you uncover a revolution in how medieval societies understood power itself. Gregory's Dictatus Papae, a manifesto declaring the Pope's supremacy over all earthly rulers, wasn't just theology, it was a political bombshell. Imagine a world where emperors derived legitimacy from the Church's blessing, only to have the Church yank that blessing away. Henry, facing rebellion from German princes emboldened by his excommunication, had no choice but to kneel in the snow, The image of a crowned emperor submitting to a pope's mercy sent shockwaves across Christendom, proof that spiritual authority could topple temporal power. Yet Canus's drama was just one act in a much longer struggle. The Concordat of Worms in 1122 didn't just split the difference, it rewrote the rules of engagement. Emperors retained the right to grant lands and titles to bishops, the secular investiture, while the church alone could bestow spiritual authority with ring and staff. This delicate compromise masked a seismic shift. Monarchs could no longer claim divine right unchecked. Their power now had limits enforced by an institution that answered to a higher throne. The ripple effects transformed medieval governance. Local churches, once extensions of royal administration, became pipelines of papal influence. Bishops now juggled dual loyalties to the crown that granted their estates and the pope who held their souls. This tension birthed new political philosophies, with scholars arguing whether kings were God's deputies or the pope's subordinates. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to Wittenberg's door 4 centuries later, he was tapping into this unresolved fault line, proof that the wounds of the Investiture Controversy never fully healed. What makes this clash a defining moment isn't just the temporary triumph of popes over emperors. It's how it exposed the fragility of imperial authority when stripped of sacred legitimacy. The medieval world learned a dangerous lesson. Power without the blessing of heaven was just force, and force alone could never build an empire to last. From Canus's snow to Worms' parchment, this struggle redefined the boundaries between church and state boundaries we still debate today. The dusty roads of France teemed with peasants and princes alike in the summer of 1096, all answering Pope Urban II's electrifying call at Clermont. Deus vult, God wills it became the battle cry that sent tens of thousands marching toward Jerusalem, armed with equal parts religious zeal and naked ambition. But the First Crusade was never just a pilgrimage with swords. It was a perfect storm of papal politics, feudal hunger for land, and the desperate hope of salvation, all converging to redraw the medieval world. Consider the sheer improbability of their success. By the time the Crusaders reached Antioch in 1098, starvation and desertion had whittled their forces to a fraction of the original host. Yet when they finally breached Jerusalem's walls on July 15, 1099, the bloodshed that followed chroniclers wrote of rivers flowing crimson through the Temple Mount shocked even their contemporaries. The establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem wasn't just a military victory. It was the birth of a colonial experiment. Frankish knights suddenly found themselves ruling over a patchwork of Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian communities, their courts adopting local customs even as they built castles like Crac des Chevaliers to secure their fragile hold. What truly transformed this moment into a historical pivot, though, was the unintended exchange it sparked. European merchants trailing the Crusaders discovered spices, silks, and scientific texts preserved in Arabic Aristotle's lost works, Persian medical treatises, Indian mathematics. When these treasures reached places like Toledo's translation schools, they ignited intellectual fires that would eventually fuel the Renaissance. The same war that deepened religious divides also wove commercial and cultural threads between Venice and Damascus, Genoa and Alexandria. Venetian ships ferrying Crusaders east returned laden with sugar, citrus, and mirrors, creating tastes that revolutionized European lifestyles. Yet the Crusades' darkest legacy was the hardening of ideological frontiers. The massacre of Jerusalem's inhabitants and the later Muslim reconquest under Saladin in 1187 cemented narratives of holy war that still echo in modern conflicts. When Pope Urban raised his voice at Clermont, He couldn't have foreseen how his plea to liberate the Holy Land would mutate into centuries of cyclical violence, or how the very idea of crusading would be invoked in everything from colonial conquests to extremist manifestos. This paradox defines the First Crusade's place in history, a campaign born of faith that unleashed both enlightenment and enduring strife. The Latin East's fleeting kingdoms crumbled, but the bridges they built and burned reshaped trade routes, scientific thought, and the very concept of East versus West. In the end, the Crusaders' greatest conquest wasn't territory. It was the irreversible intertwining of three continents' fates, proving that even war's chaos can sow the seeds of a new world. The winds howling across the steppes in the year 1206 carried more than just dust. They carried the birth cries of an empire that would stretch from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. When Temujin, an orphaned outcast who'd survived betrayal and starvation, stood before the gathered Mongol tribes as Genghis Khan, universal ruler, he wasn't just claiming a title. He was forging a new kind of power, one that would prove nomadic horsemen could outthink, outfight, and outlast the mightiest settled civilizations. What set the Mongols apart wasn't just their legendary horseback archery, it was their revolutionary meritocracy. In a world where European knights and Chinese mandarins inherited their status, Genghis promoted generals based on skill, not bloodline. A blacksmith's son could command armies. A woman like his daughter Alakai ruled vassal kingdoms. Their military tactics were equally innovative. Scouts relayed messages using an early Pony Express system, while feigned retreats lured enemies into deadly traps. When they besieged cities, they employed captured engineers to build catapults that hurled not just stones but plague-ridden corpses, a grim precursor to biological warfare. The true marvel of the Mongol Empire, though, was what happened between conquests. The Pax Mongolica, their enforced peace across Asia, turned the Silk Road into a highway of ideas as much as goods. Persian astronomers shared celestial maps with Chinese scholars in Karakoram, the empire's capital. European merchants like Marco Polo traveled safely from Venice to Beijing, returning with tales of paper money and coal fires. And when gunpowder, originally a Chinese alchemical curiosity, reached Europe via Mongol trade routes, it would eventually topple medieval castles and change warfare forever. Yet their legacy cuts both ways. The same trade networks that spread silks and spices also carried Yersinia pestis, the Black Death. As Mongol armies besieged Kaffa in the 1340s, they unwittingly launched history's deadliest pandemic by catapulting infected corpses over city walls. Within decades, the plague would kill a third of Europe's population, collapsing feudal systems and labor shortages that inadvertently raised wages for survivors. When the empire fragmented after Kublai Khan's death, it left behind a paradox: ruthless conquerors who practiced unprecedented religious tolerance, illiterate warriors who established a census system so precise it put modern bureaucracies to shame. Their greatest lesson wasn't in how to build an empire, but in how to connect one. For the first time, a shepherd on the Volga could taste Indonesian nutmeg, a Parisian monk could read Persian algebra, and a Korean diplomat could debate theology with a Hungarian bishop. The Mongols didn't just conquer the world, they stitched it together, proving that even the briefest empires can alter the course of civilization. Runymed's waterlogged meadows squelched underfoot in June 1215 as England's most powerful barons faced their despised king across a makeshift table. The air reeked of damp parchment and barely contained fury. This wasn't just a negotiation, but an ultimatum. After years of extortionate taxes, military failures, and arbitrary arrests, King John's own nobles had turned against him, forcing the reluctant monarch to affix his seal to a document that would change the course of governance forever. The Magna Carta, or Great Charter, might have begun as a feudal power struggle, but its ripples would eventually topple the divine right of kings itself. What made this moment revolutionary wasn't the immediate aftermath. John had the charter annulled within months, plunging England into civil war, but the ideas it unleashed. For the first time in European history, written law bound a ruler's authority. Clause 39's promise that no free man could be imprisoned or stripped of property without the lawful judgment of his peers planted the seed of due process, while clauses limiting arbitrary taxation echoed future cries of no taxation without representation. Even the document's survival was a stroke of historical luck, reissued under John's son Henry III, then embedded in English legal tradition by Edward I. It became a weapon for reformers across centuries. Yet the Magna Carta's genius lay in its adaptability. 17th century parliamentarians wielded it against the Stuart kings. American colonists cited it while drafting the Bill of Rights, and Nelson Mandela invoked it during his Rivonia trial defense. The Charter's vague phrasing, originally intended to protect baronial privileges, became a linguistic chameleon, reinterpreted to champion everything from jury trials to habeas corpus. When the Founding Fathers penned life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they stood on the shoulders of those rain-soaked nobles at Runnymede. The irony, this cornerstone of democracy emerged from profoundly undemocratic circumstances. The barons cared little for commoners. Their revolt aimed to curb royal abuse of their own class, not establish universal rights. But like a stone tossed into a pond, the principles they codified rippled far beyond their intent. England's later parliament, born from councils of nobles advising the king, grew into a representative body because the Magna Carta had established one radical notion: power, even crown power, had limits. Centuries later, when suffragettes marched or civil rights activists faced fire hoses, they weren't just fighting for new ideals, they were demanding the fulfillment of promises inked onto sheepskin in 1215. The Magna Carta proved that sometimes the most enduring revolutions begin not with triumph, but with a desperate compromise between the powerful, one that accidentally hands future generations the tools to dismantle tyranny itself. Dawn hadn't yet touched the Theodosian walls on May 29, 1453, when the largest cannon ever forged roared to life, shaking the earth like the wrath of God. For 53 days, Constantinople, the last jewel of Rome's empire, had withstood Mehmed II's siege, its triple walls defying every assault. But now the Ottoman Sultan's secret weapon, a monstrous bronze gun called the Basilica, hurled half-ton stone balls that cracked the ancient defenses like eggshells. This wasn't just the fall of a city, it was the moment the medieval world gasped its last breath, and a new era clawed its way into existence. What made Constantinople's collapse so earth-shattering wasn't merely the military defeat, it was the rupture of a 1,000-year continuum. Since Constantine the Great consecrated the city in 330, its libraries had preserved Plato and Aristotle while Europe languished in the Dark Ages. Its artisans perfected mosaics that turned sunlight into liquid gold, and its diplomats played empires like chess pieces. Now, as Ottoman janissaries poured through the breaches, scholars scrambled to save what they could, stuffing manuscripts into saddlebags before fleeing west. These refugees became history's accidental revolutionaries, carrying Greek texts that would ignite Florentine minds and spur Michelangelo's hand. The Renaissance didn't just benefit from Byzantium's fall, it was born from its ashes. Mehmed knew exactly what he'd won. Riding into the Hagia Sophia, he scooped a handful of dirt onto his turban in humility before ordering the cathedral's conversion to a mosque. But his vision extended beyond religion. He rebuilt the city as Istanbul, a cosmopolitan hub where Jewish merchants, Greek doctors, and Persian architects thrived under Ottoman rule. The same man who shattered Christendom's eastern bulwark also funded the first printed world map and established markets that linked Bengal to Belgrade. Yet the tremors reached far beyond politics or art. With the Silk Road now under Muslim control, European merchants faced ruin unless they found new routes east. A Genoese navigator named Columbus, studying maps smuggled from Constantinople, would later gamble on a westward voyage to circumvent the Ottomans, a detour that accidentally unveiled the Americas. The spice trade's disruption didn't just inspire exploration. It redrew the global economy, shifting power from Mediterranean city-states to Atlantic ports like Lisbon and London. The true lesson of 1453 isn't that empires die, it's how their deaths fertilize the future. Byzantium's ghost lingered in Russia's claim as the Third Rome, in the Enlightenment's rediscovery of Greek democracy, even in the Vatican's frantic push to reclaim holy sites through crusading rhetoric. When those walls finally crumbled, they didn't just bury an empire, they unlocked the modern world's gates, proving that sometimes destruction isn't an end, but the first note of a new symphony. The stench of rotting flesh choked the streets of Messina in October 1347, when 12 Genoese trading ships limped into harbor with crews either dead or delirious with fever. Within days, the Sicilian port city became a graveyard, buboes swelling in victims' armpits and groins, skin blackening from internal bleeding, whole families perishing before priests could deliver last rites. This wasn't just an outbreak, it was the opening act of history's deadliest encore, as Yersinia Pestis, the Black Death, began its 4-year rampage across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. By the time the pestilence burned out, it hadn't merely killed an estimated 25 million, it had gutted the medieval world's foundations and forced survivors to rebuild civilization from its bones. What made the plague so devastating wasn't just the scale of death, it was how indiscriminately it struck. Kings and cardinals died alongside beggars and lepers, exposing the fragility of feudal hierarchies. With half the workforce gone, peasants who once toiled for lords suddenly found their labor in desperate demand. In England, the Statute of Laborers in 1351 tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but economics trumped decrees. Serfs abandoned manors for cities offering higher pay, while landowning nobles, starved of rent income, sold freedoms to retain workers. The old order of tide to the soil peasants and all-powerful aristocrats crumbled like a plague victim's rotting flesh. Even faith buckled under the strain. Prayer processions and relics failed to stop the dying, while priests obligated to administer last rites perished at catastrophic rates. In the vacuum, radical movements like the Flagellants emerged, their public self-whippings a grotesque performance of penitence. Artists processed the trauma through dance macabre frescoes, showing skeletons leading popes and emperors in a mocking dance of equality in death. The Church's monopoly on salvation frayed, planting seeds of doubt that would later blossom into the Reformation. Yet amid the despair, innovation flourished. Depopulation forced survivors to work smarter. Water mills replaced manual grain grinding. 3-field crop rotation boosted yields, and labor-saving devices like the printing press gained traction. Italian city-states pioneered quarantine laws, while new banking systems emerged to manage inherited wealth. The Mongols, whose empire had already fragmented, never recovered. Their loose administrative structures collapsed without enough herders to tend flocks or soldiers to patrol borders. Meanwhile, resilient regions like Flanders thrived by specializing in high-value textiles, proving adaptability was the ultimate currency. The Black Death's true legacy lies in its paradox, a catastrophe so horrific it shattered medieval certainties, yet cleared space for the Renaissance, the rise of the middle class, and even modern medicine. When the next pandemic came, whether cholera or COVID, humanity's playbook of isolation protocols and economic pivots still carried echoes of those desperate, transformative years. The plague taught civilization a brutal lesson, that progress sometimes walks hand in skeletal hand with devastation, and from the darkest hours, the brightest rebirths can emerge. The fields of Crecy ran slick with blood in August 1346, where a new kind of war was born, one that would drag two kingdoms through a century of fire and reshape what it meant to belong to a nation. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a feud over crowns and territories. It was the crucible where medieval notions of loyalty to a lord melted away, replaced by something far more potent: allegiance to a homeland. When English longbowmen, humble yeomen in leather jerkins, rained arrows that pierced French knights' gleaming armor at Agincourt in 1415, they weren't just winning a battle, they were proving that the age of chivalric nobility was crumbling, and the common man's role in warfare would never be the same. At the heart of this conflict lay a tangle of dynastic claims. Edward III of England, grandson of Francis Philip IV, declared himself rightful heir to the French throne, sparking a struggle that would outlive generations. But what began as a royal family quarrel soon spiraled into something larger. French peasants, watching their villages burn under English chevauchée raids, began seeing themselves not as subjects of a feudal lord, but as Frenchmen. The same shift happened across the Channel, where Parliament's power grew as English kings demanded ever more taxes to fund the war. National identity, once a vague concept, hardened in the furnace of shared suffering and victory. Then came the girl who changed everything, Joan of Arc, a 17-year-old shepherdess who heard divine voices, embodied this newfound nationalism in a way no noble ever could. Dressed in white armor, she lifted the siege of Orleans in 1429, turning the tide of the war and crowning Charles VII at Rheims, a symbolic act that cemented France's legitimacy. Her subsequent capture and burning by the English only amplified her legend, transforming her into a martyr whose name still stirs French hearts today. Joan's story proved that faith and patriotism could mobilize masses more effectively than any feudal levy. The war's economic toll was equally transformative. Both kingdoms teetered on bankruptcy, forcing rulers to innovate. England's parliament gained unprecedented leverage over royal finances, while France's Valois kings centralized power to raise armies without relying on unruly nobles. These fiscal experiments laid groundwork for modern states, one stumbling toward constitutional monarchy, the other toward absolutism. When the dust settled in 1453, England had lost all continental holdings except Calais, and France emerged unified but exhausted. Yet the war's true legacy wasn't territorial, it was psychological. The idea that a peasant might fight for France or England rather than for his local baron marked a seismic shift in how people imagined communities. And when England's noble factions, deprived of French plunder, turned their swords on each other in the Wars of the Roses, they unknowingly proved another lesson, that the fires of war don't just forge nations, they temper them, sometimes breaking old systems so completely that only something new can rise from the ashes. The 100 Years' War taught Europe that conflict could be more than destruction. It could be a forge, hammering scattered feudal fragments into the steel of modern nationhood. The borders drawn in blood would fade, but the identities born in its chaos would endure, whispering through revolutions, world wars, and even today's debates over what it means to belong. Frost clung to the sails of cog ships sailing from Novgorod to Bruges in the 13th century, their hulls packed with Russian furs, Flemish wool, and Baltic amber, a precious cargo that turned a loose alliance of German merchants into an economic superpower. The Hanseatic League wasn't just a trade network, It was a medieval corporate empire, one where ledgers carried more weight than swords, and where cities like Lübeck and Hamburg operated like independent republics, answering to no king. In an age of feudal oaths and divine right monarchs, these merchant princes built a system where profit, not pedigree, dictated power. What set the Hanseatic League apart was its ruthless efficiency. Their contours trading posts from London to Bergen functioned like early multinational offices with standardized weights, contracts, and even dispute resolution protocols. When Danish King Valdemar IV tried to tax their ships in 1361, the League didn't negotiate. They assembled a fleet, besieged Copenhagen, and forced him to surrender 2/3 of Denmark's crown revenue. This wasn't just business, it was geopolitics conducted by accountants. Their wars were fought with embargoes as much as cannons, like when they blockaded Norway for 3 years to crush a rival's fish trade, starving entire regions into submission. The League's true revolution, though, was cultural. Their trade routes became highways for ideas. Lübeck's red brick Gothic architecture spread to Tallinn and Stockholm, while Hanseatic scribes pioneered early double-entry bookkeeping. Even the plague traveled their shipping lanes, reaching Norway via an infected wool shipment to Bergen in 1349. But the same networks that spread death also disseminated innovation. Riga's shipwrights borrowed Dutch designs, while Reval's blacksmiths adapted German metallurgy, creating tools that boosted agricultural yields across the Baltic. Yet their greatest legacy was invisible, a new economic mindset. When Hanseatic merchants pooled capital to fund risky ventures, they invented early joint stock principles. THEIR Chinese letter letters precursors to modern banking. Let a merchant in Gdansk pay a supplier in Bruges without hauling chests of silver. This system proved so robust that when the League declined in the 15th century, outmaneuvered by Dutch competitors and crippled by the Black Death's labor shortages, the infrastructure they built endured. The stock exchanges of Amsterdam and London owed their DNA to Lübeck's counting houses. The Hanseatic League's lesson wasn't just about commerce, it was about leverage. They showed how interconnected trade could bend kingdoms to its will, how a well-timed embargo could topple a throne, and how wealth, when organized, could rival the might of empires. In a world still obsessed with crowns and crusades, these merchants quietly wrote the playbook for modern capitalism: one voyage, one contract, one ledger entry at a time. Granada's Alhambra Palace shimmered like a mirage in the January sun of 1492. Its intricate arabesques and reflecting pools a final testament to 7 centuries of Islamic Iberia. When Boabdil, the last Nasrid Sultan, handed the city's keys to Ferdinand and Isabella, it marked more than the end of the Reconquista. It was the closing act of medieval Europe's longest culture war. But the Catholic monarch's triumph wasn't just a military victory. It was the birth of a new imperial dogma, one where religious purity and territorial ambition fused into a force that would soon straddle continents. The fall of Granada completed Spain's unification under the cross, yet its aftermath revealed the dark paradox of the age. That same spring, Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree, expelling Jews who refused baptism, upward of 200,000 souls whose ancestors had called Iberia home since Roman times. Silk weavers, physicians, and financiers who'd sustained Al-Andalus's golden age now fled to Ottoman lands, taking with them knowledge that would fuel Istanbul's Renaissance. Meanwhile, Torquemada's Inquisition, originally conceived to root out false converts, metastasized into a terror apparatus, its auto-da-fe spectacles burning dissent in town squares. The message was clear: this new Spain would tolerate no deviation from Catholic orthodoxy, not in faith, not in bloodline, not in thought, yet history's ironies abound. The same treasury that funded Granada's siege also bankrolled an eccentric Genos navigator's westward gamble. Columbus's voyage, launched mere months after Boabdil's surrender, wasn't just exploration, it was an extension of the crusading spirit, seeking not only spices but souls to convert. When his ships stumbled upon the Americas, they unleashed a colossus, a global empire where Mexican silver financed Flemish wars, where Manila galleons linked Acapulco to Macau, and where the phrase, "the sun never sets," became literal truth. The Reconquista's completion offers a brutal lesson in how victory can be as destabilizing as defeat. By purging the scholars, artists, and merchants who'd made Al-Andalus Europe's most advanced society, Spain gained unity at the cost of vitality. The Inquisition's shadow stifled scientific inquiry just as Copernicus revolutionized astronomy elsewhere. And while Cortés and Pizarro conquered new worlds with Toledo steel, their brutality abroad mirrored the intolerance forged at home. What lingers isn't just the echo of marching boots or the scent of burning parchment, but the haunting question, can any empire thrive when it trades diversity for dogma? Granada's fall wasn't an ending, it was a warning etched in the Alhambra's fading stucco, that the price of absolute victory is often paid in the currency of lost wisdom. The smell of molten metal and fresh ink hung thick in Johann Gutenberg's Mainz workshop around 1440, where a deceptively simple machine was quietly dismantling the medieval world's intellectual hierarchy. The printing press didn't just produce books, it shattered the church's centuries-old monopoly on knowledge, turning ideas into contagions that could spread faster than any army or inquisition could contain. Until then, books were painstakingly copied by monks, their Latin phrases locked away like relics in cathedral scriptoria. Now, with movable type and oil-based ink, a single press could churn out hundreds of identical pages in a day, each one a potential spark for revolution. Consider the explosive impact of this transformation. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to Wittenberg's church door in 1517, handwritten copies might have gathered dust in a few university halls. Instead, printed pamphlets carried his critique of indulgences across Germany in weeks, their woodcut illustrations making complex theology accessible to illiterate peasants. By 1520, over 300,000 copies of Luther's tracts circulated, equivalent to a modern viral post reaching millions. The Holy Roman Empire's censors, accustomed to controlling manuscripts one quill at a time, were suddenly outflanked by an information tsunami. But the press's reach extended far beyond religious upheaval. Kings who once relied on scribes to record laws now flooded their realms with printed decrees, standardizing languages and centralizing authority. English, French, and Spanish gradually eclipsed Latin as the lingua franca, forging national identities through shared vernacular texts. Bureaucracies discovered the power of paper trails. Tax rolls, passports, and census data could now be duplicated and archived, creating the scaffolding of modern states. Venice's government even printed standardized forms for ship manifests, turning ad hoc record-keeping into a system precise enough to track cargo from Alexandria to Antwerp. The most profound shift, however, was cognitive. Medieval minds viewed texts as sacred objects, their authority derived from scarcity and tradition. The press democratized doubt by making conflicting ideas visible. Readers could compare Aristotle's original works with contemporary critiques, or weigh Catholic dogma against Lutheran sermons. Scientific breakthroughs, once hoarded by elite circles, now raced across Europe. Copernicus's heliocentric theory, published in 1543, might have died with him without the press to amplify its heresy. Gutenberg's invention proved that empires aren't just built on land and gold, but on the flow of information. The same technology that empowered Luther to challenge Rome also enabled Spain to administer its global colonies, England to circulate Shakespeare's plays, and merchants to standardize contracts from Lisbon to Danzig. Knowledge, once the property of the privileged few, became a currency anyone could mint, and like all revolutions, its consequences were impossible to predict. When scribes warned that mass-produced books would weaken memory, they weren't entirely wrong. They just failed to imagine how profoundly literacy would expand human thought itself. The rugged hills of northwestern Anatolia in 1299 seemed an unlikely birthplace for an empire that would eclipse Byzantium and shake Europe to its core. Osman, a minor Turkic bey, ruled nothing more than a scattering of villages, his warriors little more than raiders preying on crumbling Byzantine outposts. Yet within a century and a half, his descendants would build a war machine so formidable that their very name, Ottomans, became synonymous with both terror and tolerance across 3 continents. Their rise wasn't just military conquest. It was a masterclass in turning diversity into strength, blending innovation with tradition in ways that redefined empire itself. At the heart of their success lay the Devshirme, a system as brilliant as it was brutal. Every few years, Ottoman agents would comb Christian villages in the Balkans, selecting the brightest boys, often no older than 8, to be raised as Muslims and trained as janissaries or administrators. These children of shepherds and peasants became the empire's elite, soldiers feared for their discipline, scribes who ran vast bureaucracies, even grand viziers who governed in the sultan's name. The janissaries, forbidden to marry or own property, owed loyalty solely to the throne, creating a counterbalance to the old Turkic nobility. Imagine the psychological genius taking the empire's potential enemies and turning them into its most devoted servants. But the Ottomans' real stroke of genius was the millet system. Conquered Jews, Christians, and other non-Muslims weren't forced to convert. Instead, they were organized into self-governing communities under their own religious leaders. A Greek Orthodox patriarch, an Armenian bishop, or a Jewish rabbi could collect taxes, settle disputes, and even draft their flock into labor corps, so long as they paid the jizya tax and acknowledged Ottoman supremacy. This wasn't modern multiculturalism. Non-Muslims faced restrictions and occasional persecution, but compared to contemporary Europe's pogroms and inquisitions, it offered remarkable stability. Thessaloniki became a Sephardic Jewish haven after Spain's expulsion, while Mount Athos's monasteries preserved Byzantine traditions untouched. Suleiman the Magnificent's reign marked the empire's zenith, not just territorially but legally. His canon laws didn't replace Sharia but complemented it, regulating everything from market prices to the length of military campaigns. Judges in Cairo, Budapest, and Baghdad applied the same standardized codes, creating predictability across cultures. Meanwhile, Ottoman architects like Mimar Sinan dotted the skyline with domed mosques that rivaled Hagia Sophia, while poets penned verses in a Turkish so refined it became the empire's lingua franca from Algeria to Azerbaijan. Yet for all their sophistication, the Ottomans remained Europe's nightmare. Their siege engineers mastered gunpowder tactics, toppling Constantinople's walls with massive cannons like the Basilica. Their navy, commanded by pirates turned admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa, turned the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake, raiding as far as Italy's coast. Only at Vienna's gates in 1529 did their westward expansion finally stall, not because of any single defeat, but because the empire had overextended, its bureaucracy creaking under the weight of its own diversity. The Ottomans' true legacy lies in proving that empire could be more than just conquest. It could be a carefully balanced ecosystem where different peoples, faiths, and traditions could coexist under a single banner. Their system sustained realms as diverse as Yemen's coffee farmers and Hungarian wheat growers for 6 centuries, outlasting nearly every contemporary dynasty. When modern politicians debate how to govern pluralistic societies, they're unconsciously grappling with questions the Ottomans answered, and sometimes failed to answer centuries ago. The imperial chancery in Nuremberg buzzed with scribes in 1356, their quills scratching out a document that would shape Central Europe's destiny for centuries. The Golden Bull, named for its shimmering seal, wasn't just another decree, it was the Holy Roman Empire's desperate attempt to prevent its own disintegration. By locking 7 powerful princes into an exclusive electoral college, the bull traded short-term stability for long-term paralysis, creating a system where choosing emperors became smoother, but governing their empire became nearly impossible. What made this compromise so revolutionary was its precision. The bull didn't just name electors, it micromanaged their rituals down to the color of their robes and the order of their processions. The Archbishop of Mainz would summon the others, the King of Bohemia would host the first banquet, and all voting would happen in Frankfurt's stiflingly hot chapel, where haste might discourage endless scheming. These weren't trivial details, they were psychological masterstrokes, turning what could have been bloody power struggles into choreographed theater. For the next 450 years, this script would determine who wore the imperial crown, from Habsburg dynasts to the occasional wildcard like the Wittelsbach Charles VII. Yet the bull's fatal flaw lay in what it didn't do. While it prevented disputed successions, it gave emperors no real mechanism to override territorial princes. Without a standing army or reliable tax base, rulers like Frederick III spent decades begging their own subjects for funds to fight the Ottomans. Compare this to France, where the Valois kings were centralizing power, or England, where Parliament, though fractious, could mobilize national resources. The empire became a paradox, a colossus with jeweled regalia but hollow veins, its strength sapped by the very system designed to preserve it. The cultural consequences ran even deeper. By cementing Germany's patchwork of bishoprics, duchies, and free cities, the bull ensured no single capital, no London or Paris, could emerge as a unifying hub. While Renaissance Florence or Baroque Vienna cultivated artistic revolutions, the empire's creative energy diffused among regional courts in Munich, Dresden, and Heidelberg. This fragmentation birthed dazzling diversity, Bach's cantatas in Leipzig, Dürer's prints in Nuremberg, but left the empire vulnerable to neighbors who spoke with one voice. When Napoleon finally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, he wasn't just toppling an ancient institution, he was euthanizing a system the Golden Bull had frozen in time. Its legacy lingers in modern Germany's federal structure, where regional identities still outweigh centralized authority. Some laws don't just govern, they sculpt the future's bedrock for better or worse. The bull proved that stability bought at the price of adaptability is ultimately a pact with obsolescence. Rain turned the fields of Agincourt into a sucking quagmire on October 25, 1415, where mud-clogged French knights in polished armor learned a brutal lesson that no amount of noble blood could stop an English arrow tipped with Bodkin steel. King Henry V's army, starving and sick with dysentery after weeks of marching, faced a French force at least 3 times its size. Yet by day's end, 6,000 Frenchmen lay dead, including much of their aristocracy, while Henry lost fewer than 500 men. This wasn't just a battle won, it was the medieval world's social order upended, proving that peasant-born longbowmen could topple mounted nobility with nothing but yew wood and disciplined volleys. The secret to English success lay in the longbow's terrifying physics. A skilled archer could lose 12 arrows a minute, each traveling 200 feet per second with enough force to punch through plate armor at close range. But technology alone didn't win Agincourt. It was Henry's cunning use of terrain. He funneled the French advance into a narrow valley flanked by woods, forcing their overconfident knights to charge uphill through knee-deep mud where their heavy armor became a death trap. Packed shoulder to shoulder, the French couldn't even raise their weapons as English billhooks dragged them from saddles and daggers found gaps in their visors. The most lethal killers weren't Henry's arrows, but the very chivalric ideals that compelled French nobles to fight on foot beside their men, turning them into sitting ducks. Yet Agincourt's aftermath proved hollow. Though the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 made Henry heir to France's throne, his early death left an infant son ruling two bankrupt kingdoms. The English public, initially euphoric, soon groaned under wartime taxes that funded no lasting gains. Meanwhile, France's decimated nobility created a power vacuum filled by charismatic leaders like Joan of Arc, who rallied the demoralized nation to expel the invaders. The battle's legend grew not because it secured victory, but because it epitomized the futility of medieval warfare's escalating costs, a lesson modern superpowers would relearn in Vietnam and Afghanistan centuries later. What makes Agincourt endure isn't just the underdog narrative. It's how the battle forced societies to confront uncomfortable truths. The longbow democratized violence, proving commoners could overthrow elites with simple tools and tactics. Chivalry's romantic veneer cracked when noble corpses were stripped naked by looters and piled in mass graves, and the battle's propaganda value, immortalized by Shakespeare, outlasted its strategic impact, showing how myths often matter more than reality in shaping national identity. When modern athletes invoke Band of Brothers or politicians reference Happy Few, they're channeling Agincourt's ultimate paradox, that history remembers not who won the war but who told the best story. Dawn had barely touched the Parisian skyline on Friday the 13th, 1307, when royal bailiffs kicked in doors across France, dragging groggy Templar knights from their beds in chains. King Philip IV, nicknamed the Fair for his golden locks but decidedly less so in his dealings, had spent months plotting this strike against Christendom's most formidable monastic order. By sunrise, hundreds of knights, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, found themselves accused of grotesque heresies, spitting on the cross, worshipping demonic idols, even engaging in illicit rituals. The charges were absurd, but their purpose was brutally clear. Philip didn't want justice, he wanted the Templars' gold. The Templars were no ordinary monks. Founded 2 centuries earlier to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, they'd evolved into a transnational financial powerhouse. Their network of commanderies stretched from London to Jerusalem, functioning as medieval ATMs where crusaders could deposit funds in Europe and withdraw them in Acre. Kings borrowed heavily from their vaults, including Philip himself, who owed them a staggering sum. But what made the Templars truly dangerous was their independence. Reporting only to the Pope, they operated outside royal control, their treasure chests a tantalizing prize for a French crown, drowning in debt from wars with England and Flanders. Philip's machinations revealed the dark art of political destruction. Under torture, Templars confessed to every lurid accusation. Smoke and mirrors turned pious bankers into heretics, their reputations shredded by show trials. When Pope Clement V, himself a French puppet, disbanded the order in 1312, it wasn't just an institution that fell, it was the illusion of church invincibility. The same Templars who'd once been the papacy's sword and shield were abandoned to the flames, proving no vow of poverty or piety could shield you from a king's arithmetic. The financial aftershocks were equally seismic. With the Templars' banking system in ruins, merchants and monarchs turned to secular alternatives. Italian families like the Medicis and Bardi filled the void, their ledgers untangled from religious oversight. Interest, once condemned as usury, became an open practice, Dumoulin dying curse that Philip and Clement would join him in death within a year proved eerily accurate, but the real reckoning was historical. The Templars' fall taught Europe that money, not divine favor, was the new lingua franca of power. Yet their ghost lingered. Rumors of hidden Templar treasure fueled conspiracy theories for centuries, while their organizational blueprint inspired everything from Swiss banking secrecy to modern multinationals. The true heresy wasn't in their rituals, it was in proving that even God's bankers could be outbid by earthly kings. When the last Templar stronghold at Toma surrendered, it wasn't just an order dissolving. It was the medieval world's balance of power tilting irreversibly toward the secular, where credit ratings would someday matter more than crusading vows. The summer of 1315 should have brought golden fields of wheat and barley to Europe's countryside. Instead, the heavens opened in a relentless deluge, drowning crops in waterlogged soil that refused to dry. For 3 harrowing years, the rains never stopped. Seedlings rotted before they could sprout, livestock drowned in flooded pastures, and granaries stood empty as mold crept up their damp walls. The Great Famine didn't just bring hunger, it peeled back the veneer of medieval society, exposing how fragile the feudal contract truly was when bread vanished from the table. At first, the nobility tried to maintain the illusion of control. Lords raised taxes on starving peasants to compensate for lost harvest revenues, while monasteries sold fake relics claiming to summon divine intervention. But as desperation spread, so did chaos. In Flanders, mobs stormed castles to loot grain stores. In England, chroniclers wrote of parents abandoning children in forests to save themselves. The most chilling accounts came from Ireland, where court records described strangers' flesh sold in the markets and gallows crowded with those caught eating stolen corpses. This wasn't just scarcity, it was societal collapse, proving that hunger could unravel centuries of custom faster than any invading army. The famine's timing made its devastation even crueler. Europe's population had been swelling for generations, pushing marginal lands into cultivation. When the rains came, these fragile farms failed first, leaving no buffer against disaster. Compounding the crisis, colder global temperatures, now known as the onset of the Little Ice Age, shortened growing seasons. Trees as far south as the Alps showed stunted growth rings for decades, silent witnesses to a climate shift that would shape history. What made this catastrophe a defining moment wasn't just the suffering, it was the political reckoning that followed. Peasants who survived the famine emerged with a dangerous realization: their lords couldn't protect them from nature's whims. The feudal bargain, labor in exchange for security, lay broken. When the Black Death arrived 30 years later, survivors of the famine were quicker to abandon manors for cities offering wages, accelerating feudalism's decline. Even the church's authority suffered as prayers failed to bring sun or salvation, planting early seeds of doubt that would later flower into the Reformation. The Great Famine's legacy lingers in unexpected ways. It spurred innovations like crop rotation and fish farming to hedge against future disasters. Urban bakeries began stockpiling grain, creating the first rudimentary food security systems. Most profoundly, it taught Europe that empires built on agricultural surplus were only one failed harvest away from ruin, a lesson that echoes today in an age of climate uncertainty. When modern scientists study medieval tree rings or ice cores, they're not just reading the past, they're deciphering a warning written in rain and rot, reminding us that no kingdom, no matter how mighty, can thrive when the earth itself turns against it. Florence's cobblestone streets hummed with the clink of gold florins in the early 15th century, where a family of wool merchants turned bankers were quietly rewriting the rules of power. The Medici didn't conquer cities with armies, they bought influence with ledgers, their loans weaving a web that ensnared popes, kings, and artists alike. What began as a modest money-changing bench in the shadow of the Duomo became a financial empire that proved something revolutionary. In the right hands, a banking vault could wield more authority than a royal scepter. Cosimo de' Medici, the dynasty's cunning patriarch, understood that true power wasn't just about wealth, it was about perception. While other Florentine elites flaunted their riches with gaudy palazzos, Cosimo commissioned Brunelleschi to design the austere yet elegant Palazzo Medici, its rusticated stone whispering quiet dominance. He funneled fortunes into libraries, salvaging ancient Greek and Latin manuscripts that Muslim and Byzantine scholars had preserved. These weren't just books, they were weapons in a cultural arms race, reviving Plato's philosophy to challenge the Church's intellectual monopoly. When the Council of Florence in 1439 brought Byzantine emperors and Orthodox patriarchs to his doorstep, Cosimo didn't just host them, he showcased Florence as the new Athens, with Medici gold underwriting the Renaissance itself. Yet the family's genius lay in their dual playbook. As they funded Fra Angelico's ethereal frescoes and Donatello's revolutionary sculptures, they also bankrolled the papal wars that kept their rivals in check. Pope Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was a Medici CEO in a mitre, using family loans to fund his military campaigns while commissioning Raphael to decorate the Vatican. Michelangelo, plucked from a sculptor's workshop as a teenager, spent years crafting marble masterpieces under Medici patronage, only to later design their family mausoleum in the Basilica of San Lorenzo. The message was clear: art and power weren't separate realms, they were two sides of the same florin. The Medici's most enduring innovation, though, was financial. Their invention of double-entry bookkeeping and letters of credit transformed Europe's economy, allowing money to move across borders without physical coins. When King Edward IV of England needed funds to reclaim his throne during the Wars of the Roses, it was Medici agents who financed his mercenaries, collateralized by future wool revenues. Their network stretched from London's wool markets to Constantinople's spice bazaars, proving that capital could flow faster than any army could march. But even dynasties built on gold have their reckonings. Savonarola's fiery sermons in the 1490s exposed the rot beneath Florence's gilded surface. His bonfire of the vanities consumed Medici-sponsored art alongside gambling paraphernalia. The family's exile proved temporary, but their eventual return as dukes rather than bankers marked a subtle decline. The same system they'd mastered using culture to legitimize power eventually trapped them in the gilded cage of hereditary rule, their financial acumen diluted by aristocratic pretension. What makes the Medici story pivotal isn't just their patronage of geniuses like Botticelli or Galileo. It's how they revealed the alchemy of influence, that money could buy immortality if spent on ideas rather than crowns. Their legacy lingers not in faded account books but in the Uffazes galleries, the Laurentian libraries' manuscripts, and even modern finance's DNA. When today's tech billionaires fund space exploration or AI research, they're unwittingly following a playbook written in Renaissance Florence, proof that the most enduring empires aren't carved in stone, but forged in the intangible currency of human imagination. Prague's new town hall windows shattered on a sweltering July afternoon in 1419, as furious Hussite rebels seized 7 Catholic councillors and hurled them onto the cobblestones below. Miraculously, the victims survived. Some claimed the Virgin Mary cushioned their fall, while others whispered they'd landed in a dung heap. But the defenestration of Prague wasn't about the drop, it was about the message. With this brazen act, a local religious dispute erupted into Europe's first war, fueled by both heresy and nationalism, proving that faith and identity could ignite conflicts as explosive as any dynastic feud. Jan Hus, the martyred preacher whose name became the Hussite battle cry, had been burned at the stake just 4 years earlier for challenging church corruption. His followers, Czech peasants, nobles, and tradesmen alike, saw his execution as proof that Rome would never tolerate reform. When King Wenceslaus IV died weeks after the defenestration, his Catholic successor Sigismund vowed to crush the rebellion, unleashing a crusade that would pit Europe's mightiest armies against a people's revolution. What followed wasn't just a war, it was a laboratory for military innovation. The Hussites, led by the one-eyed General Jan Žižka, transformed farmers' wagons into mobile fortresses chained together into impenetrable circles. These Wagenburgs bristled with early handguns and crude artillery, shredding charging knights with coordinated volleys before counterattacking with flails and pikes. For the first time, disciplined infantry backed by gunpowder could withstand cavalry charges, a tactic that would echo through the ages, from the tercios of Spain to the trenches of World War I. Beyond the battlefield, the Hussite Wars exposed a tectonic shift in European politics. Sigismund's crusaders came from Germany, Hungary, and beyond, turning the conflict into a proxy war between Czech identity and foreign domination. Hussite battle hymns weren't just prayers, they were anthems of national defiance, sung in vernacular Czech rather than Latin. When the Council of Basel finally negotiated peace in 1436, the compromise allowing laypeople to receive communion in both bread and wine was less significant than the precedent it set. A grassroots movement had forced the mighty church to negotiate with heretics, proving that dogma could bend before popular will. The defenestration's true legacy lies in its symbolism. Those shattered windows became a Prague tradition. The same act would recur in 1618, helping spark the 30 Years' War, and again in 1948 as communists seized Czechoslovakia. Each time the gesture screamed the same truth: that authority, no matter how entrenched, could be defied with a single act of collective courage. The Hussite Rebellion taught Europe that ideas, when fused with national pride, could mobilize armies more effectively than feudal oaths, a lesson that would echo from the Protestant Reformation to the American Revolution. Sometimes history turns not on grand battles or treaties, but on the moment when ordinary people decide they'd rather throw rulers out windows than kneel before them. The snow lay thick over Toten Field in March 1461, where the Wars of the Roses reached its bloodiest crescendo, a storm of steel and slaughter so brutal that chroniclers claimed the rivers ran red for days. This wasn't just another skirmish between England's rival noble factions. It was the moment the old medieval order bled itself dry, clearing the way for something entirely new. The Yorkists, with their white rose badges, and the Lancastrians, cloaked in red, had been locked in a dynastic death spiral for decades, their claims to the throne tangled in the twisted branches of Edward III's family tree. But what began as a quarrel among aristocrats would end by reshaping the very nature of English power. At the heart of this conflict lay a paradox: the very nobles who fueled the violence sowed the seeds of their own downfall. By the time Henry Tudor, a Welsh exile with a tenuous claim, landed at Milford Haven in 1485, England's aristocracy had been decimated. Tower records show over 50 noble families wiped out entirely, their castles seized, their lineages extinguished. The Battle of Bosworth Field, where Henry's forces clashed with Richard III's, wasn't just the war's finale, it was a changing of the guard. When Richard fell, his crown reportedly rolling under a hawthorn bush, it symbolized more than a king's death. It marked the eclipse of feudal barons who'd treated the throne as their personal prize. Henry VII's genius wasn't military, it was bureaucratic. Marrying Elizabeth of York united the warring roses symbolically, but his true masterstroke was dismantling the systems that had enabled the chaos. The Court of Star Chamber, originally a tool for arbitrating noble disputes, became a royal hammer against baronial power. He taxed lords heavily to fund standing mercenaries, removing their private armies' leverage. And when pretenders like Lambert Simnel claimed rival bloodlines, Henry didn't just defeat them, he exposed their frauds publicly, turning impostors into laughingstocks. This was statecraft as theater, designed to undermine the very idea of competing dynasties. Yet the Tudors' rise also reflected a deeper shift in English identity. The printing press, still a novelty during the war's early years, spread propaganda favoring Henry's narrative, casting Richard as a hunchbacked villain in plays and pamphlets. Merchants, weary of disrupted trade, rallied behind a king promising stability, and the new liturgy introduced under Henry VIII, though decades later, capitalized on this centralization, replacing Latin masses with English prayers that subtly reinforced royal supremacy over both church and nobility. What makes the Wars of the Roses a defining moment isn't just the gore or the political marriages, it's how they forced England to confront the cost of weak governance. The Tudors didn't just inherit a crown, they inherited a lesson that empires aren't built on swords alone, but on systems that tame the ambitions of the powerful. When Elizabeth I surveyed her realm a century later, her golden age owed its peace not to the absence of claimants, but to a bureaucracy so finely tuned that rebellion became unthinkable. The roses may have wilted in those muddy fields, but from their thorns grew the roots of global empire. The stench of burning parchment choked Baghdad's air in February 1258, as the Tigris River swallowed more than ink it drowned an era. When Hulagu Khan's Mongol siege engines finally breached the Abbasid capital's walls, they didn't just topple a caliphate, they unleashed a cultural holocaust. Libraries housing Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, and Islamic jurisprudence were fed to the flames or tossed into the river, their pages dissolving into a black tide that stained the water for weeks. The Grand Library of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, had been a beacon for scholars across continents, a place where Jewish physicians translated Galen's medical texts, where Hindu mathematicians introduced the numeral zero to Arab astronomers. Now its treasures turned to sludge under Mongol boots. Hulagu's ruthlessness wasn't random, it was calculated terror. The Mongols rolled the last Abbasid caliph, al-Mustasim, in a carpet and trampled him with horses, a symbolic execution denying him the sacred earth burial demanded by Islamic tradition. The message was clear: no dynasty, no matter how illustrious, was invincible. Yet in this devastation lay an irony the conquerors couldn't foresee. As Baghdad's scholars fled westward, they carried fragments of knowledge to Cairo, Damascus, and eventually Moorish Spain, scattering the seeds of Abbasid learning far beyond their homeland. The Mamluk Sultanate, though a military regime, became an unlikely custodian of this legacy, transforming Cairo's madrasas into new centers of intellectual gravity. Meanwhile, history pivoted at Ain Jalut in 1260. The Mamluks, former slave soldiers turned rulers of Egypt, did what no army had managed. They defeated the Mongols in open battle. Using feigned retreats and superior knowledge of the Palestinian terrain, they shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility. This victory didn't just save Egypt, it preserved Islam's western heartlands as a refuge for the Abbasid survivors. A shadow caliphate was established in Cairo, though its authority was more symbolic than real. The true power shift went deeper. Islam's geopolitical axis moved decisively away from Mesopotamia toward the Nile and the rising Ottomans in Anatolia. The Fall of Baghdad teaches a brutal lesson about the fragility of civilizations. The Abbasids had presided over algebra's birth, perfected celestial navigation, and pioneered hospitals with separate wards for contagious diseases. Yet their bureaucratic complacency, taxing peasants into poverty while the caliph composed poetry, left them defenseless against a world evolving beyond their control. When the Mongols arrived, the Abbasid military relied on outdated tactics and underpaid Turkic mercenaries who deserted at the first clash. Empires, no matter how brilliant, atrophy when they mistake cultural prestige for permanent security. Yet from this wreckage emerged an unexpected rebirth. Persian historian Rashid al-Din, employed by the Mongols themselves, would later compile the first global history, synthesizing Chinese, Islamic, and European chronicles. The Ilkhanate, Hulagu's own dynasty, eventually converted to Islam and became patrons of the very scholarship their founder had tried to erase. And the Mamluks, though warriors by trade, commissioned the stunning geometric madrasas and mosques that still crown Cairo's skyline. The Abbasid flame didn't extinguish, it dispersed, proving that knowledge, even when uprooted by violence, finds ways to regrow in the cracks between empires. The blackened Tigris may have swallowed libraries, but it couldn't drown the human hunger to remember, rebuild, and endure. The royal decree that established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 bore the lofty language of religious purity, but its ink smelled of something far more earthly, political calculation. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, fresh from their triumph over Granada, now turned their gaze inward, convinced that Spain's salvation lay in rooting out any whisper of heresy. What began as a campaign against Jewish and Muslim converts who secretly practiced their old faith, so-called conversos and moriscos, soon metastasized into a vast engine of terror, one where faith became inseparable from obedience to the crown. Consider the chilling efficiency of their methods. Inquisitors didn't rely on spontaneous denunciations. They institutionalized suspicion. During the Edict of Grace, citizens were given a window to confess heresy voluntarily, but this mercy was a trap. Those who came forward provided names, relationships, and patterns of behavior that the Inquisition catalogued in meticulous detail. Neighbors accused neighbors, children informed on parents, and the accused were pressured to name others in exchange for leniency. The system fed itself, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of fear. Torture wasn't just about extracting confessions, it was theater, designed to break the spirit of entire communities. Public autos da fe, where the condemned were paraded in humiliating San Benito robes before execution, weren't merely punishments, they were propaganda spectacles reinforcing the price of dissent. Yet the Inquisition's true innovation was its bureaucracy. Every accusation, every trial, every confiscation of property was recorded in triplicate, creating a paper trail that would make modern auditors envious. When a wealthy converso merchant was convicted, his assets didn't vanish into noble coffers, they flowed into royal treasuries, funding Isabella's patronage of Columbus's voyages and Ferdinand's wars in Italy. The Inquisition became a self-funding instrument of state power, its tribunals operating like a shadow tax system that targeted not income but identity. The human cost was staggering. Historians estimate that over 3 centuries, the Inquisition tried around 150,000 people, executing between 3,000 and 5,000. But numbers alone can't capture the cultural devastation. Families were ripped apart, centuries of coexistence between Christians, Jews, and Muslims unraveled. and intellectual life withered as scholars fled to Ottoman lands or Italy, taking with them the very knowledge that had once made Al-Andalus Europe's brightest beacon of learning. What makes the Spanish Inquisition a defining moment isn't just its brutality, it's the blueprint it provided for modern authoritarianism. Its blend of religious dogma, surveillance, and economic exploitation foreshadowed the mechanisms of totalitarian regimes centuries later. The Inquisition taught rulers a dangerous lesson: that unity, when enforced at the point of a sword, is merely the silence of the dispossessed, and in that silence empires may rise, but they seldom endure. The sun blazed mercilessly over the Anatolian plateau in August 1071, where the Byzantine Empire's fate hinged on the loyalty of mercenaries who'd already been paid their weight in gold. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes had marched his army deep into Seljuk territory, confident his heavy cataphract cavalry could crush the nomadic Turks. But when his Pecheneg and Frankish mercenaries betrayed him mid-battle, fleeing the field at Manzikert, the unthinkable happened. The Byzantine standard fell, and the emperor himself was dragged before Sultan Alp Arslan in chains. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment the empire's eastern gates swung wide open, allowing Turkic tribes to pour into Anatolia, the Byzantine heartland that had stood firm for centuries. What made Manzikert so catastrophic wasn't just the loss of territory, it was the psychological blow. Byzantium had survived Persian sieges, Arab invasions, and Viking raids, always emerging bruised but unbroken. Now, the myth of imperial invincibility shattered like the fragile gold-glass mosaics in Constantinople's churches. The Seljuks, once seen as just another steppe nuisance, proved they could outmaneuver the empire's rigid battle formations with lightning-fast horse archers and psychological warfare. Alp Arslan, showing unexpected mercy, released Romanos after extracting favorable terms only for the emperor to return home and be blinded by his own court rivals, plunging Byzantium into civil war. The message to the Turkic clans watching from the edges of the plateau was clear: this wounded giant wouldn't recover easily. The political aftershocks rippled far beyond Anatolia. With its eastern provinces slipping away, Byzantium desperately turned westward, begging Pope Urban II for military aid. That plea, amplified by reports of Seljuk mistreatment of Christian pilgrims, became the tinder for the First Crusade in 1095. Ironically, the Crusaders' success created new problems: Latin kingdoms carved from former Byzantine lands, whose rulers often clashed with Constantinople. The empire never fully regained its lost territories, instead becoming a shadow of its former self, squeezed between Crusader states, Venetian merchants, and the rising Ottoman tide. Manzikert's true legacy lies in its slow burn devastation. The battle didn't just transfer land from one ruler to another, it transformed the very demographics of Anatolia. Turkic pastoralists, previously confined to the fringes, now migrated en masse, their languages and customs gradually displacing Greek traditions. Cities like Nicaea and Iconium became Iznik and Konya, their churches slowly converted into mosques. By the time the Ottomans besieged Constantinople in 1453, Anatolia had been Turkicized for generations, its people no longer seeing themselves as Byzantine subjects. The battle's lesson is one of unintended consequences. Alp Arslan likely saw Manzikert as just another raid to secure his borders, not the opening act of a civilization's decline. Yet history often turns on such pivots: a mercenary's betrayal, an emperor's miscalculation, a sultan's unexpected mercy. When the Seljuk Turks rode victorious from that dusty field, they weren't just claiming a battlefield, they were unwittingly laying the foundation for a Turkic world that would stretch from the Aegean to the Persian Gulf, proving that sometimes the greatest empires rise from the cracks of others' misfortunes. The Sahara's dunes stretched endlessly under a blistering sun, hiding a secret that would dazzle the medieval world, the Mali Empire, where rivers of gold flowed beneath the desert surface. When Mansa Musa, its ninth ruler, embarked on his Hajj to Mecca in 1324, he didn't travel as a humble pilgrim. His caravan stretched across the horizon like a mirage made flesh. 60,000 men clad in Persian silks, 12,000 slaves each carrying a 4-pound gold bar, and 80 camels laden with sacks of gold dust. By the time he reached Cairo, the sheer volume of wealth he distributed so lavishly that the city's gold market crashed and took a decade to recover wasn't just generosity. It was a calculated display of power from a kingdom most Europeans hadn't known existed. Mali's fortune wasn't conjured from thin air. It was mined from the earth and harvested from trade routes older than Rome. The empire sat atop 3 pillars: gold from the Bambuk mines, salt from the Sahara's Taoudeni deposits, and the intellectual capital of cities like Timbuktu, where scholars traded manuscripts under roofs of beaten gold. Salt, worth its weight in gold in sub-Saharan markets, moved north on camel caravans. Gold traveled south to Mediterranean ports, where Italian and Arab merchants bartered for it with glass beads and silk. This wasn't just commerce, it was an economic alchemy that turned desert crossings into highways of prosperity. At the heart of this system stood Timbuktu's Sankore University, a beacon of learning that dwarfed contemporary European institutions. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, mathematics, and law, many penned in gold ink on indigo-dyed vellum. Scholars from Cairo to Cordoba traveled months to study under Mali's imams, who debated everything from Aristotle's logic to the medicinal properties of desert herbs. The empire's griots, oral historians trained to memorize centuries of genealogy and treaties, were living databases whose knowledge guided royal decisions. While Europe's universities fixated on theology, Timbuktu's classrooms fused Islamic scholarship with indigenous African wisdom, creating a synthesis as dazzling as the gold leaf on its mosque's domes. Yet Mali's true genius lay in governance. Mansa Musa didn't just hoard wealth, he institutionalized it. His postal system, modeled after the Mongols, allowed information to race across the empire faster than a galloping horse. Provincial governors, often former generals, kept trade routes secure but answered to a centralized bureaucracy in Naini, where scribes recorded every transaction in meticulous Arabic script. Even the empire's decline held lessons. When Songhai rebels toppled Mali in the 15th century, they didn't destroy its systems, they absorbed them, proving that the real treasure wasn't the gold itself, but the knowledge of how to cultivate prosperity in the harshest soil. The legacy of Mali shatters stereotypes of pre-colonial Africa as a land of scattered tribes. Here was an empire with paved streets, street lighting, and a welfare system for the poor centuries before such concepts took root in Europe. When modern economists marvel at Timbuktu's tax receipts or architects study the great mosque's ventilation systems, they're glimpsing a civilization that mastered the art of turning scarcity into abundance. The sands that once hid Mali's cities now whisper a timeless truth. That wealth isn't found but forged by the hands that dig, the minds that plan, and the rulers who understand that gold's true value lies not in its gleam but in what it builds. The waters off Greece's Lepanto Peninsula churned crimson on October 7, 1571, as 600 galleys locked in the last great naval battle fought entirely between oared ships. The Holy League, a fragile alliance of Spain, Venice, and the papacy, faced an Ottoman fleet that had dominated the Mediterranean for decades. What unfolded wasn't just a clash of empires, but a collision of worlds. Christian crossbowmen firing from high forecastles against Turkish janissaries armed with composite bows, European gunpowder facing Ottoman numerical superiority. By sunset, 40,000 men lay dead or drowning, their blood staining the Ionian Sea. Lepanto's tactical brilliance lay in the Holy League's unorthodox adaptations. Don John of Austria, the 24-year-old Habsburg bastard commanding the coalition, broke tradition by arming his galleys with massive forward-firing cannons, a gamble that shattered Ottoman formations before boarding actions even began. Venetian galleasses, floating fortresses with dozens of guns, anchored the flanks, their firepower shredding Turkish attempts to encircle. Yet the real turning point came when the League's rowers, many unchained for the battle, joined the melee with makeshift weapons. This wasn't just victory through technology, but through morale, enslaved Christians fighting for their freedom alongside their captors. The battle's aftermath reveals history's cruel irony. Though the League destroyed or captured nearly 200 Ottoman ships, their triumph proved less decisive than the propaganda suggested. Within a year, the Turks rebuilt their fleet, and Cyprus, the island whose fall had triggered the conflict, remained in Muslim hands. What Lepanto truly shattered wasn't Ottoman power, but their aura of invincibility. European pamphlets celebrated the win as divine intervention, fueling a cultural resurgence that painted the Mediterranean as a spiritual battleground. The rosary, popularized as the weapon that won the day, became Catholicism's symbolic shield against Islam. Among the maimed survivors was a 24-year-old Spaniard named Miguel de Cervantes, whose left hand hung useless after taking 3 gunshot wounds. His later masterpiece, Don Quixote, brims with Lepanto's echoes. The delusional knight tilting at windmills mirrors the Holy League's quixotic crusade against an empire that ultimately outlasted its victors. The novel's bittersweet tone, celebrating heroism while mocking its futility, may well have been forged in the screams and smoke of that October day. Lepanto's legacy endures not in shifted borders, but in shifted minds. It proved that coalitions of rivals could unite against a common threat, a lesson Europe would relearn against Napoleon and Hitler. Its blend of gunpowder and sails heralded the end of galley warfare, steering navies toward the broadside tactics of the age of exploration. And in Cervantes' quill, the battle birthed something even rarer, a reminder that history's greatest victories often lie not in the battles we win, but in the stories they inspire. The marshlands of Lake Texcoco shimmered under the midday sun in 1428, where an unlikely alliance was about to reshape the destiny of the Americas. The Aztec Empire, born from the triple alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, didn't conquer through brute force alone. They mastered their environment with an ingenuity that turned a swamp into the beating heart of Mesoamerica. While European cities choked on their own waste, Tenochtitlan's engineers designed floating gardens called chinampas, artificial islands woven from reeds and fertile lake mud that produced 7 harvests a year. Canals crisscrossed the city like veins, carrying not just goods but the lifeblood of an empire where even the poorest could access fresh produce from bustling marketplaces. What set the Aztecs apart wasn't just their agricultural brilliance, it was their revolutionary tribute system. Conquered cities paid taxes not just in gold or maize, but in specialized goods: obsidian blades from Atumba, jaguar pelts from the tropical lowlands, even live eagles for ceremonial sacrifices. This wasn't mere plunder, it was a decentralized economic engine that turned diversity into strength. A feather worker in Tenochtitlan could craft headdresses with quetzal feathers from Guatemala, while cocoa beans, a currency more reliable than European coins, flowed along routes guarded by Pochteca, merchant spies who doubled as the empire's eyes and ears. Yet the Aztecs' true power lay in their cosmic ambition. The Templo Mayor, their twin pyramid heart, wasn't just a religious site, it was a living metaphor. One side honored Tlaloc, the rain god essential for crops. The other paid tribute to Huitzilopochtli, the sun god who demanded war to fuel the dawn. This duality defined their empire, prosperity and violence intertwined like the serpents carved into temple walls. Their flowery wars, ritual battles against rival cities, served multiple purposes: training warriors, capturing sacrificial victims, and maintaining a controlled tension that kept vassals in line. When Cortés arrived in 1519, he didn't encounter a primitive society. He faced a sophisticated state with libraries of pictographic codices, a legal system that punished corruption more harshly than theft, and an urban planning marvel that dwarfed Madrid in scale and sanitation. The Spanish conquistadors marveled at aqueducts delivering fresh water and public latrines, innovations their own homeland lacked. But the very bridges that connected Tenochtitlan's island to the mainland became its downfall, allowing Cortés to isolate the city during his brutal siege. The Aztec Empire's legacy pulses through modern Mexico in unexpected ways. The Chinampa system still feeds communities around Xochimilco, while Nahuatl words like chocolate and avocado pepper global languages. More profound is the cultural resilience, the way Day of the Dead ceremonies preserve pre-Columbian views of life and death, or how muralists like Diego Rivera resurrected Tenochtitlan's grandeur in paint. Empires may fall, but the echoes of their innovations, whether floating gardens or feather art, never truly fade. The Aztecs proved that greatness isn't just measured in territory or gold, but in the ability to transform a landscape, both physical and spiritual, long after the last emperor has fallen. Winter gripped the German town of Constance in 1414 as the greatest gathering of medieval Christendom converged to untangle a holy knot, three men simultaneously claiming to be God's sole representative on earth. The Council of Constance wasn't called to debate theology or launch crusades. Its mission was surgical: end the Western schism that had fractured the Church for nearly 40 years. What unfolded over 4 bitter winters was less a spiritual revival than a political masterstroke, where emperors and cardinals played a high-stakes game of thrones with eternal souls as collateral. The schism's roots ran deep. Since 1378, rival papal courts in Avignon and Rome had dueled for supremacy, each excommunicating the other's followers. The chaos reached absurd heights when a third pope emerged from the Pisan Council in 1409, turning the Holy See into a three-way shouting match. Ordinary parishioners didn't know which mass was valid or which sacraments would save them, a crisis of faith that threatened to unravel the social fabric of Europe. Enter Emperor Sigismund, who leveraged his imperial authority to summon the council, not as a supplicant, but as the secular arm of Christendom's will. His message to the squabbling pontiffs was unambiguous: resign or face deposition. The council's boldest stroke came with the decree Hic Sancta in 1415, declaring that even popes must obey ecumenical councils in matters of faith and unity. This wasn't just administrative tidying, it was a theological earthquake, suggesting ultimate authority rested with the collective body of the Church, not the papal throne. When all three claimants finally stepped down or were pushed in favor of Martin V, it marked the first time in history a council had dismantled and rebuilt the papacy itself. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the Church might evolve into a constitutional monarchy of sorts, with checks on papal power. Yet the council's darker legacy unfolded in its dealings with Jan Hus, the Czech reformer whose criticisms of indulgences and clerical corruption echoed Wycliffe's earlier heresies. Granted safe passage by Sigismund himself, Hus arrived in Constance expecting debate, only to find a tribunal. His trial was less about doctrine than optics, a demonstration that the newly reunified church wouldn't tolerate dissent. When the flames consumed him in July 1415, the crowd reportedly smelled roasting pork as the martyr sang hymns through the smoke. This act of brutal theater backfired spectacularly. Instead of extinguishing reform, Huss's ashes ignited the Hussite Wars, proving that repression often fertilizes the very rebellions it seeks to crush. The Council of Constance's paradox lingers across centuries. It achieved unity through coercion, championed collective governance while silencing dissent, and inadvertently proved that no amount of political maneuvering can stamp out the sparks of reform. When Luther nailed his 95 Theses a century later, he was standing on the shoulders of both the Council Fathers who had dared to challenge papal infallibility, and the martyrs they burned for doing the same. History's cruelest joke, that the very assembly which healed one schism planted the seeds for another far greater. From Charlemagne's coronation to the last echoes of Constantinople's fall, these 30 moments weren't just entries in a history book. They were the very gears turning the medieval world toward our modern age. Think of each one as a domino in an epic chain reaction, one tipping into the next, reshaping languages, borders, and even how we see power itself. The rise of empires wasn't just about kings and conquests, it was about the accidents, gambles, and sheer human stubbornness that bent the arc of history. Take something as simple as the way you sign your name or the coins in your pocket. Those everyday acts carry fingerprints from medieval bureaucrats, merchants, and monarchs who wrestled with the same problems we face today: how to govern fairly, how to adapt to change, and how to leave something lasting behind. When Charlemagne standardized handwriting or the Magna Carta challenged absolute rule, they weren't just solving their own crises, they were drafting blueprints we still live by. And here's the thing about these empires: they didn't rise because they were invincible. They thrived because they adapted. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they connected continents, turning trade routes into threads of a global tapestry. The Ottomans didn't merely expand, they wove diverse cultures into a single, resilient system. Even in collapse, they left lessons. The Byzantines' fall scattered scholars who ignited the Renaissance, while the Black Death's devastation inadvertently freed survivors to demand better wages and rights. So when you pass a Gothic cathedral or use a word like algebra, you're not just seeing relics of the past, you're touching the living legacy of choices made centuries ago. That's the real magic of history. It's not a static timeline but a conversation, one where we're still responding to ideas scribbled on parchment or forged in battle. If this journey through the empires that shaped our world sparked your curiosity, don't let it end here. Smash that like button to let us know, subscribe for more deep dives into history's most pivotal crossroads, and drop a comment below. Tell us which empire fascinates you most, whether it's the maritime might of the Vikings or the bureaucratic brilliance of the Ottomans. Until next time, keep exploring the stories hidden in plain sight, because history isn't just about the past, it's the map to understanding who we